Is the Earth really warming? And if so, is it due to human activity or natural cycles? Is the planet in peril? These questions spark heated debates. But regardless of your position in the debate, you might be failing to consider some extremely relevant information. My guest, Alex Epstein, wants to change how we think about environmental issues. In his new book, Fossil Future, he makes an unexpected argument that for humans to flourish, we need to use more oil, coal, and natural gas, not less. He's here now to make his case. Alex, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
This is a fascinating book. You start by making the bold claim in your subtitle, and then you make another claim that by the end of the book, the reader should be persuaded to promote increasing the use of fossil fuels to avoid catastrophe of fossil fuel elimination policies. I just want to warn the viewers who don't know you that you're actually a philosopher first and an energy expert second. So the angle that you're coming from is trying to help us improve our thinking about these issues. There's a lot to discuss, so let's get into it. In my intro, I alluded to a fact that there's an aspect of the fossil fuel debate that rarely gets mentioned, particularly in environmental science classes, which is that humans are actually able to flourish in this inhospitable planet precisely because of fossil fuels. Can you start by fleshing that out for us?
Sure. And I think that philosophy is really relevant. People think of, when they hear I'm a philosopher first, they think, oh, well, why are you talking about energy? But one thing I try to show in the book is I think 90% of divergence on this issue has to do with philosophy. And I think if you think about it with a rational, pro-human philosophical perspective, it's actually obvious that we should use more fossil fuels. And that can sound crazy because we're told, oh, all the experts say that we should get rid of fossil fuels very quickly. And then here I am saying, well, no, we should actually be using more of them. But it's so, you mentioned people don't talk about the value of fossil fuels on this inhospitable planet. And one way of putting that is we don't talk about the benefits of fossil fuels, which if you step back, that's crazy. Because if say you're evaluating a prescription drug, everyone knows you have to carefully look at the benefits and the side effects. And if you just looked at the side effects, then you wouldn't make a good decision. And yet we see at the highest levels, and I document this pretty rigorously, that so many of our leading thinkers and institutions totally ignore the benefits of fossil fuels. One example I give is one of our leading climate thinkers, a climate scientist named Michael Mann, talks in a whole book, this celebrated book, about the negative impacts of fossil fuels on agriculture. But he doesn't talk about any of the positives, even though fossil fuels power all the machines that allow us to, almost all the machines that allow us to feed 8 billion people and provide the fertilizer via natural gas. And this failure to consider the benefits of fossil fuels, which is a really systemic failure throughout all these institutions and people who purport to be experts, that leads to things like today's energy crisis I talk about in chapter 4, which is unfortunately now come true. If you ignore the benefits of fossil fuels to food, then you're going to get far more expensive and scarce food. And that's why we're having starvation problems around the world right now.
Explain that a little more. Just describe a scenario maybe before we use fossil fuels a lot to now, or what it would look like if we totally eliminated them. Flesh it out for us, exactly all those benefits.
Well, so one thing you said that I really liked is you talked about something about the benefits on this inhospitable planet. And I think the baseline that we have to recognize that most of our conversation doesn't recognize is that the Earth, including Earth's climate, is not at all hospitable to human life in its natural, so to speak, unimpacted state. So the Earth is very deficient and it is very dangerous. So if human beings are going to have long, healthy, safe, opportunity-filled lives, we need to become extremely productive. There's no way around that. If we are not productive, we will be poor and we will be endangered. And that's the fate of most people throughout history. And it's the fate still of billions of people around the world. And so how do human beings become more productive? Well, the real key is using machines. If we just use our own physical bodies, we are very, very limited in our productive ability and we will be poor. But if we can use machines to do physical work for us, then we can become amazingly productive because we can do far more of the things we can do with our physical bodies and hand tools. Like we can, a modern combine harvester can reap and thresh 1,000 times more wheat than a really good manual labor can. So we amplify our abilities, but we also expand our abilities. We can do things that no number of humans can do. For example, I talk about you can power incubators around the world, and that can save millions and millions of babies' lives. but only if you have machines, and you can only have machines if you have low cost, reliable energy. And so what fossil fuels do is they provide that low cost, reliable energy that's so crucial to human life because it powers the machines that make us productive and prosperous. And fossil fuels provide 80% of that energy. They're still growing. And that's in a world where billions of people use what we would consider a totally unacceptable amount of energy, including 3 billion people using less electricity than one of our refrigerators does. So if you recognize energy is so important, low cost, reliable energy, it really makes the world livable for humans. Fossil fuels are uniquely good at providing it, and the world needs far more. That's why I say it's obvious we should be using more fossil fuels. And then when we start to look at climate, it turns out fossil fuels, one of their great benefits that nobody talks about is they allow us to master climate. So they give us such an ability to deal with things like heat and cold and storms and floods that our rate of disaster deaths from climate-related causes like storms and flood, extreme temperatures, et cetera, is down 98% over the last century. So fossil fuels are just so beneficial, and nobody is seeing it because they're ignoring these amazing benefits, including climate benefits.
Okay, so the argument I can imagine most people making at this point is like, yes, but there's also these harmful effects, and if we keep going down this path, we're on a fast track to disaster. That's literally what the UN Secretary General said in April after the last climate panel report, describing the future like this.
Major cities underwater, unprecedented heat waves, terrifying storms, widespread water shortages, the extinction of 1 million species of plants and animals. And this is not fiction or exaggeration. It is what science tells us will result from our current energy policies.
Whenever I hear arguments like that, the first thing I ask is, do they acknowledge that fossil fuels have made us far safer from climate? So if you're predicting the future, the first requirement is that you acknowledge the past and the present. And what you find is Guterres doesn't say anything like, yes, fossil fuels have made the naturally inhospitable climate amazingly hospitable. He doesn't say that. He acts like, no, they've made it much worse, and then it's going to become even worse. And this shows there's only two explanations for this. One is ignorance, and two is anti-humanism. But you have people who do know that we're safer than ever from climate, and yet they still treat it as a disaster. And the only explanation for that is that they're evaluating the climate and the world and fossil fuels by a standard of measurement, or what I call standard of evaluation, that's not human flourishing. Because if you're focused on human flourishing and we're 50 times safer from climate, how can you claim climate as a disaster? But what I identify in Fossil Future, and this is really the core of why we're against fossil fuels, or why so many are, is the standard by which many of our leaders are evaluating fossil fuels, including climate, is this standard of eliminating human impact. So it's the view that human impact on Earth is evil, and we should avoid it, and therefore we should really eliminate it. And therefore, if we've impacted climate, which I believe we have, we've contributed to 1 degree Celsius of warming in the last 100, 150, 170 years, that the view is that it's just immoral and we shouldn't do it. Versus my view is it's good or bad depending on how good or bad that warming and also greening is for humans, plus all the benefits of all the energy that comes with it.
So that's an important distinction you make a lot in your book, that there's, one starting point is a pro-human perspective, another starting point is this, fragile Earth, we shouldn't touch the Earth, it's fine as it is, any impact is going to be negative. Can we talk about renewables? What about those alternatives? Why can't they fill the gap?
So let's just review the numbers again, because I think if you just see the basic numbers, you should at least assume it's absurd, and then the burden of proof would be on the other side. So again, the world is drastically short of energy. So there are 6 billion people in the world who use an amount of energy that almost everyone watching this would consider totally unacceptable. So the world is starved of energy. Fossil fuels provide 80% of the world's energy, and they're growing. This is very important. And they're particularly growing in the parts of the world that care most about low-cost, reliable energy, such as China. So what that points to is there's something special about fossil fuels. We've been hearing about renewable alternatives for 20 plus years. They've gotten massive subsidies, which that should be suspicious, because if they're so good, why do they need subsidies? They have all sorts of preferences, including absolute mandates that we use them. And they're still 3% of the world's energy. They specifically provide only electricity, which is a relatively small portion of the world's energy itself. And they depend entirely on controllable, reliable sources, mostly fossil fuels, but also to some extent nuclear and hydro. So this is a parasitical, dependent 3% of the world's energy that needs to be subsidized and mandated. And we think it's going to replace all fossil fuel use for the people who have fossil fuels now and for the billions of people who lack energy. This should seem totally absurd, and it is. There's no actual evidence that these are really good, incredible replacements. And if you look at the places that use the most solar and wind, they add costs. And the reason is pretty simple. Because these things are unreliable, they can go near zero at any given time. So you need to pay both for the unreliable solar and wind infrastructure and for the reliable, mostly fossil fueled infrastructure. So I consider this whole renewables can rapidly replace fossil fuels. This is just a scam perpetrated by people who don't really care about energy. And the leaders, just their goal is eliminating human impact from the planet, not just the climate, but the planet as a whole. And so they're always looking for some form of imaginary energy in the future that they can claim to support so that they can actually oppose the energy of the present. And this is what Biden did, right? He shut down Keystone. He shut down new leasing of oil and gas on federal lands. He didn't have a viable replacement. His plan is just to shut down what works and then pretend that he has a replacement. And he's a big part of the reason why we have a global energy crisis.
Okay, we're just about out of time, but I do want to get to the end of your book where you talk about easy ways to convince people of your argument, or at least to get them to start thinking about things in a different way from a different starting point. So how is it that you can have a quick conversation with someone and convince them of your point of view?
Well, I think the key is to recognize whenever we think about something and whenever we talk about something, there's a framework, and a framework is a starting structure. In 99+% of conversations, people are looking mostly at negative side effects of fossil fuels and not of benefits. And so one thing you can do that's very effective is you can just say to somebody, hey, would you agree that we need to look at the full context? We need to look carefully at the benefits and at the side effects. And what you'll find is that most people will say yes. Once they agree, they're much more likely to do it. And then you can really start to look at these benefits. Like once you frame it that way, it's pretty obvious we need to use more fossil fuels.
All right. Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I can really recommend the book to people. It's very easy to read, and your arguments are laid out very simply. And you have lots of great terms that you coined that I think it's one of my favorite parts about it, actually. The empowered and unempowered world, and the delicate nurture, climate mastery, all of these things. So Alex, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.